Look how perfect they are.
No one understands, monsieur. Not even the police. Ah, here she comes.
Come, Stephen. Let's go away.
Murder can only be a kind of hobby to me.
Stephen, accompanied by his newlywed wife Valerie, was en route to a destination in Europe. While aboard the train, their conversation revealed that Stephen hailed from a wealthy American family residing in the area. Despite their differences, Stephen's mother consistently emphasized their uniqueness. When the train unexpectedly halted, Stephen ventured outside to investigate, learning of a delay ahead that would necessitate spending the night at the station. As a result, they planned to catch the next boat to England. Valerie once more urged Stephen to disclose their marriage to his mother. However, Stephen deflected the topic, prompting Valerie to inquire if he was apprehensive. With a grin, Stephen reassured her that upon reaching the station, he would promptly inform his mother about their union. The following day, Stephen and Valerie arrived at a hotel near the station and reserved the hotel's royal suite. Pierre, the receptionist and caretaker, informed them that the place was deserted due to the winter season. Subsequently, Pierre escorted them to the royal suite. While en route, Valerie halted Stephen, reminding him of his promise to inform his mother about their marriage. Stephen jotted down a message for Pierre on a piece of paper, which he handed to him, indicating there was no response. Pierre then slipped the note into his pocket and led them to the suite. Once settled, Pierre contacted them, reporting that nobody had answered the number Stephen had provided. In response, Stephen quickly instructed Pierre to persist in calling the same number, aiming to convince Valerie that he was genuinely attempting to reach his mother. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Valerie and Stephen dined together in the evening. Curiously, Valerie remarked to Stephen on the peculiarity of never receiving a response when they attempted to make a call discreetly. Disagreeing with her assessment, Stephen defended the situation. Valerie then challenged him to make an effort to persuade his mother. She suggested that he should travel to England alone to have a conversation with his mother. In the meantime, she expressed her intention to await his return at the hotel in the station, to which Stephen assented. Meanwhile, a car pulls up at the location, and Hungarian Countess Elizabeth emerges with her assistant, Ilona. Upon seeing the Countess, Pierre reminisces about encountering her in his childhood and notes that she remains unchanged. This sight unsettles him greatly. Elizabeth speculates that she might have been the woman Pierre's mother mentioned from his childhood memories. She instructs Pierre to reserve a royal suite for her, but he declines, citing that Valerie and Stephen were already occupying the suite. Pierre informs Elizabeth that the couple is scheduled to depart the following day. Upon learning this news, Elizabeth experiences a sense of disappointment. Observing Valerie and Stephen seated together and dining, Ilona joins them. Elizabeth exhibits a peculiar joy upon seeing Stephen and Valerie, leading her to agree to stay in the suite adjacent to theirs. Stephen and Valerie notice Elizabeth and Ilona observing them. However, they begin to ignore the situation and focus on their meal. Stephen approaches Pierre to convey that their departure plans have changed. Valerie inquires about Elizabeth. Upon hearing the name Elizabeth Bathory, Stephen experiences a sense of unease. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Ilona are both in their suite. While observing Stephen and Valerie outside, Ilona becomes eager to leave, but Elizabeth objects and redirects the conversation to Valerie. Drawing Ilona closer, Elizabeth discerns her jealousy. Ilona expresses a wish for Valerie's demise, leaving Elizabeth greatly perturbed. In an effort to dim the light that bothers Elizabeth, Ilona places her scarf over the lampstand and starts to be intimate. The following day, Stephen is shaving, and this caused him to feel slightly anxious. He then joins Valerie in bed, where she reads from the local newspaper about the tragic deaths of 3 girls in Bruges, all attributed to having their throats slit. The circumstances surrounding the deaths remain a mystery. Subsequently, Stephen and Valerie visit the city, only to witness another murder taking place. Upon following the sound of the siren, they arrive at the murder place, where a man approaches Stephen and describes the crime. He mentions that the victim, a stunning woman, likely lies there with multiple wounds on her neck, devoid of any blood. Stephen's emotions shift upon hearing this information. As the girl's body is removed, Stephen begins to trail after it. Despite Valerie's attempts to halt him, he persists.
Go away.
Subsequently, both Stephen and Valerie board a bus headed to Ostend, accompanied by the man who had previously recounted the details of the murder. Stephen attempts to converse with Valerie, who expresses her growing unease with his behavior. She admits to being fearful of Stephen after observing him closely. Stephen experiences an unusual sense of satisfaction upon encountering the murder victim. Meanwhile, a severe storm rages in Ostend. At the hotel, 𝐂𝐿ona prepares to depart from Elizabeth's company, but Elizabeth engages her in conversation, preventing her from leaving. Just as Elizabeth is in conversation with 𝐂𝐿ona, Stephen and Valerie arrive. Elizabeth subtly prompts 𝐂𝐿ona to excuse herself. She then addresses Stephen and Valerie, expressing relief that they did not leave her alone in the vast hotel. Subsequently, Stephen and Valerie receive an invitation to join Elizabeth for drinks in the Elizabeth Lounge. Despite their initial hesitation, Elizabeth insists and promptly summons Pierre to organize drinks in the lounge, instructing Stephen and Valerie to freshen up and join them. While heading back to their room, Pierre shares with Stephen and Valerie that the Countess had visited the place 40 years ago and still appeared unchanged. Stephen expresses skepticism, suggesting to Pierre that perhaps the Countess was his mother 4 decades prior. Inside the lounge, Valerie is seated alongside Stephen and Elizabeth. Elizabeth commences by offering praise to both Stephen and Valerie before turning the compliments towards herself. Shortly after, 𝐂𝐿ona also arrives at the gathering. Stephen's attention is drawn to 𝐂𝐿ona, prompting Elizabeth to notice her presence as well. Elizabeth calls 𝐂𝐿ona over and hands her the evening newspaper. Elizabeth then inquires with Stephen about Bruges, where he and Valerie are featured on the front page of the newspaper. They discuss an individual who arrives, the same man who previously detailed the Bruges crime to Stephen. Elizabeth reveals that the man is a policeman who she feels is taking up a lot of her time. While gazing at herself in the mirror, Elizabeth notices that her reflection is not visible. The policeman abruptly shifts the conversation to vampires, leading Elizabeth to dismiss him. Valerie and Elizabeth engage in conversation, during which Elizabeth instructs Stephen to fetch a drink for her. Upon returning, Stephen exchanges a smile with 𝐂𝐿ona and then joins the ongoing discussion. Elizabeth begins recounting how in ancient times people would consume the blood of others to maintain youthfulness. Suddenly, Stephen was, and Elizabeth asserts that he is a descendant of 𝐕𝐢𝐝 Bathory, a figure known for committing numerous crimes, including bathing in the blood of young girls. She elaborates on these atrocities, which deeply unsettle Valerie.
Them up by the wrists and whipped them until their tortured flesh was torn to shreds.
While Stephen is intrigued by the narrative, Valerie becomes increasingly distressed, eventually shouting for them to cease. Ignoring her pleas, they continue. Valerie decides to take off her clothes and take her time in her room for a bath. Upon seeing Valerie enter her room, 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona attempts to follow through the balcony. Valerie notices it and tries to check who it is.
What was that?
Sounded like a scream.
Everyone rushes to Valerie's room, where she claims to have seen someone on the balcony. However, when Stephen checks, there is no one there. Elizabeth instructs 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona to wait and deceives the group by stating that 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona is asleep in her room, feigning ignorance. Later that night, Valerie and Stephen sleep intimately, unknowingly observed by Elizabeth and 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona. The following morning, Stephen contacts his parents at Chilton Manor, who is, in fact, male. He shares news of his marriage, which disappoints his mother, though he insists on introducing Valerie to her, causing Stephen considerable distress. Unable to cope, he calls Valerie and engages in a heated argument with her. Following the altercation, their relationship turns intimate. The next day, Valerie resolves to depart from Austin and Stephen. Observing Valerie's departure, Elizabeth begins to trail her. During this time, the policeman crosses paths with Elizabeth, but she dismisses him. Meanwhile, as instructed by Elizabeth, 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona approaches Stephen in an attempt to seduce him. Elizabeth intervenes as Valerie attempts to board a train, insisting that Stephen and Valerie, being young, should remain together. Later, Valerie and Elizabeth spend the evening in each other's company, engaged in conversation. Later on, Elizabeth warns Valerie that maintaining a relationship with Stephen could lead to him treating her as a servant. Meanwhile, both Stephen and 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona engage in an intimate encounter. Elizabeth then expresses her affection for Valerie by kissing her hands and professing her love. Startled, Valerie rises to leave, but Elizabeth obstructs her path and guides her back to Stephen. Stephen guides 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona to a shower in another location. Despite 𝐂𝐿𝐿ona's fear of the water, Stephen forcefully insists that she use the shower. In a panicked attempt to escape, 𝐂𝐿𝐿 grasps a razor, accidentally injuring herself as Stephen pulls her down. Witnessing this scene, Valerie prepares to call for help, but Elizabeth intervenes, halting her and displaying affection by kissing her. Following the kiss, blood emerges from Elizabeth's lips. Valerie helps Stephen and Elizabeth wrap 𝐂𝐿𝐿's deceased body in plastic, then bury it in a remote location, a sequence observed by the policeman. While Stephen is alone, digging a grave for 𝐂𝐿𝐿, Elizabeth unexpectedly tosses 𝐂𝐿𝐿's body onto him, causing Stephen to become trapped in the hole. Valerie rescues him from this predicament. From a distance, the policeman witnesses these events. In a rush, Elizabeth murders the policeman. Returning to the hotel, Elizabeth directs Valerie to her room and sends Stephen to his own. Elizabeth and Valerie share an intimate moment, with Valerie seemingly falling under Elizabeth's influence and summoning Stephen to Elizabeth. Stephen suggests they depart, but Valerie expresses a sense of connection with Elizabeth, deterring her from leaving. She embraces Stephen as he begins to pack his belongings. Elizabeth arrives, prompting Stephen to inform her that they will not be able to join them for dinner. Despite Elizabeth's attempts to persuade him otherwise, Valerie, who previously harbored no affection for Elizabeth, finds herself falling under Elizabeth's influence once again when prompted. Elizabeth attempts to assure Stephen of his safety if he remains with her, but Stephen remains unconvinced. Elizabeth discloses that her name is Bathory and denies being a vampire, asserting that she is merely a character. Stephen prompts Elizabeth to admit that she was present in Bruges during a week marked by 4 murders, causing Elizabeth to pale. Despite Stephen's attempt to kiss Valerie, she rebuffs him and turns to Elizabeth. Upon Elizabeth's instruction, Valerie kisses Stephen instead. However, Valerie remains resentful towards Stephen for 𝐂𝐿𝐿's death and his infidelity. Blaming Elizabeth, Stephen tries to pull Valerie away, but she appeals to Elizabeth for assistance. In a violent turn of events, Elizabeth shatters a piece of glass on Stephen's head, resulting in his demise. Both Elizabeth and Valerie consume Stephen's blood as he bleeds. This implies that Elizabeth also transformed Valerie into a vampire. Later that night, Valerie and Elizabeth dispose of Stephen's body in the sea before leaving. Valerie takes the wheel, and Elizabeth urges her to speed up as dawn approaches rapidly. Suddenly, sunlight beams onto Valerie and Elizabeth, causing the car to veer out of control. The vehicle crashes, ejecting Elizabeth and impaling her heart with a tree fragment. Subsequently, the car erupts in flames, consuming Elizabeth's body. Some months later, we observe Valerie leading a couple to a destination, seemingly emulating Elizabeth's behavior. This marks the conclusion of the movie. Did this story spook you out? Let us know in the comments below. For more horror movie recaps, subscribe to our channel and we will see you in the next one. Fear awaits you.